Hi apes, today we're going to be taking a look at Unit 2, looking at biodiversity. Now, one of the key things about biodiversity, the reason why we want to protect our biodiversity, is because we get stuff from biodiversity, and what we call that is ecosystem services. So these are things that biodiversity provides for us. They can typically fit into four categories: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. So provisioning services tends to be things we get, so it's tangible stuff, like energy or food or medicine, that we get these things from the biodiversity that exists. Regulating services are things that helps to keep the ecosystem running smoothly. So things like flood prevention, how mangroves and swamplands will help to prevent floods when storms come through. Erosion control, how tree roots will anchor soil and help to prevent erosion. We have cultural services. So these are more intangible things. So we get aesthetic value here. You can have recreation. So ecotourism would fall into a good category here for cultural services. And then finally, we have supporting services. So this is how one part of an ecosystem helps the rest of the ecosystem function. So things like nutrient cycling or primary productivity, which we learned is a synonym for photosynthesis. So how we keep our ecosystems running. Now, within the ecosystem, remember that it's a factor of biotic and abiotic factors. So with those abiotic factors, they really do have a big impact on what can live where, because critters will have a range of tolerance that they live best. So the types of things we'd be looking at here are things like temperature, salinity, light, pH. So anything that might impact how they can survive, reproduce, and grow. So a critter will have an optimum range. So here in this example, we might be looking at pH or we might be looking at temperature. And at the height of this curve, that's their optimum range. So this is going to be the number of organisms. You're going to have the highest number of organisms of that species that can live at that range of tolerance. And as you get outside of that optimum range, you might still find some, but they're going to be stressed out. And then once you get past that, you're going to have intolerance where you won't find any. So once you get too cold or too warm, or you get outside of that pH range of tolerance, you're going to find that those critters will no longer be found there. So these are just some of the things that we take a look at when we're looking at impacts on biodiversity. Are they living in their optimum range of tolerance, or has the human impact stressed them out to the point where we have changed their environment outside of their ecological tolerance? Now, humans do have a big impact on diversity, but it is important for us to understand some of the basic types of biodiversity when we talk about it. So we have different levels of diversity. We have ecosystem diversity, so that's just taking a look at how many different types of actual systems are there. So here we might have an ocean ecosystem, shoreline, mountain. We have several different types of biomes that might be in this first picture. And then we take a look at within one of those ecosystems, what is the species diversity? So here, this is how many different types of species does that habitat support. Now, what we call the high number of species diversity, we call that species richness. So species richness is the number of species that you have. Now, in general, if you have more species, you have a quicker recovery from a disturbance because you have a lot of different ranges of tolerance that might come into play. And while some species might have gone extinct, the ecosystem as a whole will recover more quickly if you have a higher diversity of species in there. Now, within one species, you have genetic diversity, and this is really key for survival of critters because you can't have them all the same. If there's some type of disturbance that comes into play, then you want to have critters that have a range of tolerance for disease, for temperature, for pH, so that if the environment does change, the species as a whole won't die out. So genetic diversity is really key because humans are greatly impacting how the environment supports our diversity. And so if you have high genetic diversity, then species as a whole will have a higher chance of survival. So two key terms that we take a look at are species richness and species evenness. So remember that species richness is the number of species. But one key thing that we need to remember is it's not just number of species, but it's also the relative abundance. So I'm going to show you two pictures here, and on some measures they have equal diversity, but on some measures they don't. Okay, so here's habitat 1. Lots of different types of species, 100 individuals in here. You can probably tell this is a pretty diverse picture. And here's habitat 2. Okay, habitat 1, habitat 2. Now here, these actually have the same species richness. They have 10 species each, but you can just tell their evenness is not the same. So here the diversity is not quite the same because here you have a dominant elephant species. So we do have to take a look at two very distinct things when we're talking about diversity, both number of species, but then also how are they spread out. Now, one of the key things that leads to changes in diversity is loss of habitat. This is our biggest threat to biodiversity. Now, when we have loss of habitat, the things that are most at risk of being extinct are our specialists. So remember, our specialists had a very low range of tolerance. They can only tolerate certain food sources or certain habitats, and so they cannot adapt to change. Now, another big thing that are a threat of loss of habitat are large animals. If you're a large animal, you need a large habitat for hunting. And so as we shorten and get our habitats tighter and tighter, what's happening is our large predatory animals are losing their hunting grounds, and they just don't have enough space to get the food they need. Some of the other threats that we'll touch on later in this year, invasive species. Those are species that are introduced that don't belong there. Pollution, in its variety of forms, air pollution, land pollution, water pollution, and also over-harvesting. So these are some of our biggest threats to biodiversity. Now, one of the things that animals can do to combat our changing environment is adapting. So organisms do have to adapt to change over time. So long term, we call this evolution. The biggest thing that drives evolution is natural selection. But for short term, there can be changes in behavior, particularly if it fits into that range of tolerance that they're able to support. So our generalists are going to be able to withstand changes in the environment much more easily than our specialists. If there's a change in food and they've lost one food source, a generalist can pretty easily shift to another source of food. Now, another thing about adapting is that if it's gradual, it's much easier to adapt to. Our sudden changes are what's happening now, and that's causing the greatest problems, particularly for our specialists. So if there's a sudden change in the environment, our specialists will have to move or they might die out. Now, island biogeography is a theory that takes a look at how biodiversity changes with relationship to an island. Now here I'm going to use the term island loosely. This doesn't have to be a physical island, though it can be, but it can also be a habitat island. So you could think of, say, Central Park as an island because it's a change in that habitat within that urban area. Now, if you take a look at one of these islands, there tends to be a balance between species coming in, immigration, and species going extinct within that habitat. Now, some of the key things that come into play with this, with meeting that equilibrium point, is how big the island is and how far away from the mainland or from the source of immigration. So it tends to be that if you are a close-by island, you're going to receive a higher rate of immigration, and you're going to hit that point much quicker. And if you are a large island, so if you're close by and if you're large, you're going to be a bigger target for those immigrants coming in. Now, one of the key things that happens here is that how many resources that are there are really going to be what determines if it's going to be specialists or generalists that survive. So if you have a very specialized habitat and you have a specialist that's in there and that's established, they're going to be fine unless you have a species that becomes a better competitor, an invasive species that comes in and outcompetes them. So we'll be doing an activity that takes a look at this, takes a look at animals coming in, animals going extinct, but a lot of what comes down to is how good are they with competition, how good of a competitor are they, how adaptable are they, can they go to a different food source, can they move to a different habitat, what types of resources are available. And then when you hit that equilibrium point, the key things that are important here is how large is your island and how far away is that island. So these are just some of the things that we're taking a look at with this first part of biodiversity.